this case is a great example of why those clauses are necessary. They are clauses designed to avoid the very lawfare that this case is an example of, which is individuals who decide to, for lack of a better word, hijack the democratic process to try to insert their minority view to govern what is the decision of a duly elected government. And, if that were the case, nothing would ever get done. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Beneath the Law. I'm Gavin Ty and my partner, Stephen Teal. And Stephen, we are going to talk about some lawfare, I think, about how the courts seem to be the forum of choice for many with pet peeves with government and policies.
Is that the new term when one weaponizes the court system for political gain?
That's what I've heard.
Okay.
It's been referred to as lawfare, I think, south of the border, and probably a good name. I mean, the courts the courts are a important check and balance on government, absolutely, and government, cannot be allowed in our system, and particularly in the U.S. system. It is a very, very important check on the power of government, particularly in a parliamentary system like we have here in Canada, where basically a majority government can do pretty much whatever it wants.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't think a government should be able to run amok. But at the same time, a very small minority of individuals should not be able to impede what is sound public policy.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that is always difficult for a lot of people who talk about democracy to understand is democracy means that some people aren't going to like what's happening. The question is, are there more of them that do like what's happening? So governments are elected, and we see this all the time, on the slimmest of margins, 1 percentage point one way, 1 percentage point the other way. And all of a sudden you're governed by people who you don't like. But that is ultimately what democracy is all about. And governments do things that some people like and some people don't like. And I mean, I can think of lots of things that are occurring in our city at the moment. We're broadcasting from Toronto, but many cities around the world have many city councils around the world have, for example, just one example, found great fervor for creating bike lanes. I was in New York City recently. The bike lanes all over the place. And that is, I'm sure, the people who are cycling in those bike lanes think it's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened. And there are plenty of people who are not cycling in those bike lanes who think it's an absolute blight on the city and a curse for traffic, etc. So governments do lots of things that some people like and some people don't. And the question is, can you run off to court when a government does something or is doing something in a public works type situation that you don't like, but apparently a lot of people do, other than vote them out when the next election comes along? Do you have the right to run off to court and complain about it?
And anybody can run off to court. It's whether they are proper litigants as well, not just the merits of an issue in terms of a court, but also just whether they are proper parties before the court. And I guess, Gavin, we're going to talk about this recent case, Ontario Place Protectors versus the Ontario government, essentially, over redevelopment plans to Ontario Place, which is a former theme park in Ontario built in 1971, closed by the Liberal government in 2012 because it had fallen into disuse as a theme park, and it used to have rides and activities, for kids. I can remember, Gavin, I don't know about you, but I can remember school trips down to Ontario Place, and it was a fantastic place as a public venue to enjoy the summer, getting slushies and playing in the ballparks there, or the indoor themed activities, and then they had some rides, big amphitheater, so got closed down in 2012, and here we are the government trying to revitalize a public space, and then a group called Ontario Place Protectors, whoever they are, trying to shut down the government.
Well, they've self-named. Right. So yeah, it's funny because just so for listeners who aren't from Toronto and don't know Ontario Place, so just to put this in context, it's a large theme park, as Stephen mentioned, on the water on the lakeshore here in Ontario, in Toronto, and it was adjacent to the old exhibition grounds. So they've been around forever, and the exhibition was a tradition, still a tradition here in Toronto, which is basically a glorified Super Fall Fair back from the days when Toronto was a small town. And we still have the exhibition. So the Ontario Place was the adjunct to the exhibition, and it had rides and things like that. It had this great dome theater. I remember going there as a kid too, the school trips, and I remember watching the Cinesphere, which was this massive circular, round-shaped globe that had a full screen on it, and it was quite immersive. And I remember being blown away. It was IMAX before there was IMAX, and they had this one movie I recall, North of Superior, and you were flying in the plane, you're flying over Lake Superior. It was just fantastic. But it's funny, in Toronto right now, we've got these,
right,
and we're both being quite nostalgic about Ontario Place. And I think if you grew up in the 1970s, as we both did, this was really cool stuff when we were kids. And the other place that people went to all the time was the Science Center, and it was really cool back in the 70s. And everybody, you go there and you have all these exhibits with all these various scientific phenomena. And one I always remember is the one where you put your hand on two things and your hair would stand up in the air, and it would be this static electricity exhibit. And there were
and you still have hair. I don't.
Yeah, well, if it would fly off at this point. But the thing is both the Science Center and Ontario Place, now they're 40 or 50 years old, and they're kind of like dilapidated, junky places. We're all nostalgic about it. I remember them quite fondly. And when the government sought to, first of all, close the Science Center because it was building a subway line underneath it, as I understand, and it's going to reopen it. In fact, back now, it's moving it down to the grounds of Ontario Places, where the new location for the Science Center is supposed to be. And then they were going to rebuild Ontario Place. So a lot of people, I suppose, are crying, "Oh, my kids will never get to experience the Science Center and the Ontario Place like I did when I was a child." Well, you're right, because it was 40 years ago. There's lots of things that they won't get to experience. But a group who took themselves very, very seriously, and I like Stephen's. I think he's quoting from the Supreme Court, which precluded, quote, mere busybodies from intervening in these things. There's always going to be people, and they always come up with these grandiose names for themselves, like the Protectors of Ontario Place, whatever that's supposed to mean. It might be some guy in his underwear in his basement. Who knows who it is? But they create great names, and they get a ton of media attention, and it's as if they are a legitimate, real organization with a real stake, and they not necessarily so. Your Facebook group is not necessarily a real community organization. So I guess that was the first point when they brought their application to stop Ontario Place, the Rebuilding Ontario Place legislation, which contained within it specific exemptions from various other legislation that would put limits or what have you on rebuilding. I remember it's government limiting itself in its other laws that the government passed. And the question here was, did the government have the ability to pass a law that limited the application of another law passed by the same government? And they do that all the time.
Well, look, I don't want to be too sarcastic about, busybodies. Busybodies have a place, but they need to be responsible in terms of the way that they approach issues. Now, look, Ontario Place has sat basically vacant for 10 years or underused and underutilized for 10 years. The government has a vision. It's their land to deal with, and they wanted to revitalize it because, quite frankly, Lakeshore Boulevard is one of the places that people come to Toronto. When you're driving into Toronto, this is the route that you take. And, having a dilapidated or abandoned site certainly is not very attractive for the city. And it really does need some revitalization. So the government has put in place this legislation to revitalize. They have a vision for it. Work is being done now. And then you have this small group of people who are opposed to that. And you know what? That's okay in politics. You can oppose it. But I think what really bothers me when I read this decision is, who are you? Who are you? Like, what is your identity? And we all know that you can't just run to court and say, hey, I want to stop something, and give yourself a label. You actually have to have status. And that's the first part about this case. It's about, does Ontario Place Protectors have status? They're not a corporation. The evidence that was filed before the court didn't seem to really identify who they were. Like an ad hoc group of people, and all of a sudden now they are, in a way, representing the public because they're taking this on.
Well, they proclaim to be representing the public. I mean, we live in a society, I find at the moment, where democracy is certainly about majority. Democracy is at its core the rule of the majority. For the most part, particularly with social media these days, and often in mainstream media, it's the rule of the loudest. It's whoever's screaming the most and jumping up and down the hardest seems to get all the attention. And it's not necessarily the majority. When we hear the term the silent majority, I think for the most part, that's probably true of a great many things. I think most people, would want Ontario Place, as you mentioned right now, is iconic in Toronto. It's an iconic landmark on our waterfront. Been an iconic for decades, but it boarded up. It's sitting there, prime time, lakefront property, an iconic tourist area, an iconic area that you and I talk about, that we remember fondly from our youth, and that kids in Toronto today aren't enjoying because it's closed. So obviously it needs to be revitalized, and you may not, may not like the color they're going to paint the wall or something like that, but somebody else does. And the reality is that's what you elect governments to do. And if you don't like what the government's doing, vote them out.
Absolutely, 100%. So anyway, getting back to Ontario Place Protectors and the issue of standing, our rules of court basically provide who can be a plaintiff. And in this case, Ontario Place Protectors wasn't incorporated by any stretch, and is really not a legal entity. And so, they're trying to speak on behalf of everybody else all of a sudden. And you look, at the end of the day, there may be some substantive merit to their argument, which the court also dismissed, regardless of the fact that they lack standing. And so standing, let's talk about, I guess, a little bit about standing, Gavin, in terms of either you're a legal entity or you're a person or you're not, or you can have public interest standing. And public interest standing has certain elements to it that you need to meet, right? Whether there's a serious justiciable issue being raised, whether you have a real stake in the litigation, and whether the circumstances are such that it's reasonable and effective to bring these issues to court. And look, this is very serious because we're facing right now in our justice system a lot of delay. And the last thing that our court system needs are lawsuits brought by entities or people that really have no standing to bring lawsuits. It just continues to clog our system. And so that really gets me going in terms of the passion about this. notwithstanding the other issues in terms of the political debate, because we do need to revitalize Ontario Place. But here we are, a group of a loose knit group of people bringing a proceeding to the court to challenge this legislation to do what, at the end of the day, seems to be some sound policy. You may disagree that well, you shouldn't be leasing the land to a spa or health and wellness center, or you may disagree with, they shouldn't be cutting down all the trees at Ontario Place. But, at the same time, I'm sure that government has looked into this, will be replanting trees and, just redesigning the property so that it can be used for the enjoyment of the public. I mean, that's what we pay taxes for.
Right. I mean, there's a lot, any change of anything will have people that don't want that to occur.
Well, it's the NIMBYism, right?
And you'll have people that do want it to occur. I agree with that. But the question of standing is an important one. As you were speaking, I'm thinking about that. I mean, litigation, certainly in Ontario, is not free. It is something that you have a risk if you lose in litigation that you will have to pay costs of the other side. And, quite frankly, whether you like that or not, it actually is a pretty good and salutary rule because it, for the most part, not all the time, but it does give people pause in bringing frivolous claims because they know they're going to get dinged with a cost award at the end of it and they have to pay it. Most people don't want to do that. Now, when you've got unincorporated nothings that are non-existent fictional entities, who's going to be paying for it at the end of the day? Who are the costs awarded against? So, that I think that having skin in the game, so to speak, in litigation matters because it does stop the clogging up of the courts with frivolous lawsuits that have no consequences to the people who bring them. In addition to that, rights have to reside somewhere. I mean, if you're asserting a right, it has to belong to somebody. You've raised the important points that it can either be your individual right that you're asserting, or you can be trying to speak on behalf of a group. I mean, you'll see this all the time in public interest litigation where parties intervene in litigation, various advocacy groups on behalf of certain elements of society that they represent. And they're often granted status to intervene in these types of lawsuits. So the court wants to hear what they have to say about the issues. So, those are, but they have to have, a right has to reside somewhere. The court has to recognize that the person doing the talking has something or some ability to talk about it. In other words, it can't be just in a vacuum that somebody brings up, well, some people don't like this and I'm going to be the one that I'm going to create some fictional entity that purports to speak on behalf of this group. People have to assert their own rights.
Absolutely. So I guess, Gavin, let's dig into maybe a couple of the issues in terms of why this application exists. Is that this group views the legislation to rebuild Ontario Place as being unconstitutional in that it takes away, in their view, all causes of action against government in relation to, I guess, the work that would be done at Ontario Place and grants immunity to government officials. And my understanding, look, I mean, we've seen this in various contexts. Immunity is often granted to people who work in government. You can't necessarily bring lawsuits against certain individuals, and legislation protects that, and that is perfectly justifiable. Governments also do take away certain causes of action. And in this case, the judge actually found that the specific provision that was at issue did not take away all causes of action and did not oust the jurisdiction of the court as Ontario Place Protectors was arguing.
Well, it's interesting. I pause parenthetically. It's quite ironic. This case is a great example of why those clauses are necessary. They are clauses designed to avoid the very lawfare that this case is an example of, which is individuals who decide to, for lack of a better word, hijack the democratic process to try to insert their minority view to govern what is the decision of a duly elected government. And if that were the case, nothing would ever get done.
Well, and I think that's what is really troublesome about this, is that all we're talking about is a redevelopment of land. We're not talking about some kind of extreme policy on the part of government that has been invoked. They're trying to redevelop a property that has been basically left abandoned, and in some cases in a dilapidated state, because let's face it, just like your Ontario Place example, government does a bad job of maintaining the infrastructure that they build. They just move on from one infrastructure project to another, forgetting that they actually have to, at a certain point in time, repair the previous infrastructure that they've built.
Well, stuff does go out
here
of
we
date.
are.
I mean, buildings. There are some buildings that are timeless. But I have to say the Ontario Place building was very 1970s-esque. It was kind of like, it looked like the set from Star Trek. The 1960s version of Star Trek. It needed some updating, and it was no example of. And the Science Center was a similar architectural gem, one of the most lovely poured concrete 1970-esque buildings around. So these are not like something that are necessary of preservation from an architectural perspective.
No, but you still have to take care of it.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Look, let's face it. I mean, the one thing about theme parks, okay, we've done an episode on Disney. Theme parks need to be revitalized. You cannot keep them in the same state year after year after year. And so Disney and Universal Studios and Canada's Wonderland, Paramount, all of these private businesses constantly think about advances, new themes, new ideas, to make sure that the theme park is kept fresh. And let's face it, Ontario Place was not being kept fresh. It was the same old thing, and
it was mothballed.
Right, and after a while, people have different interests. So anyway, the court dismissed also on the merits the constitutional argument that was being made, and then the other new argument, I guess, that was raised was this idea of a public trust, that somehow the government had some form of responsibility, like a parent, to preserve and protect the integrity of Ontario Place, because it was some form of a public resource. I'm not sure how you end up with a public resource that isn't used, but that was the argument being made. And so the doctrine of public trust has been raised, which has been rejected so far in Canada.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are interesting arguments. I don't know that Ontario Place is the place to make it. I think you're absolutely right. Buildings and theme parks and the Science Center and Ontario Place are not frozen in time. They need to be updated. For the Science Center, most certainly, science has come a long way since 1972. So you need to constantly refresh those types of facilities, just like you would in a commercial enterprise. Let's face it. Like, people go back to Disneyland year over year because every year it's different. They don't go back.
You're right.
They don't
absolutely.
go back to the same old thing every time. If I've been there, done that, I don't go anymore. So if you're in that business, and let's face it, that's what Ontario Place and the Science Center are. They're attractions that try to draw people down to them. They need to keep up with it, or else people will just stop going. I mean, I have to confess that I haven't been to Ontario Place in decades, nor did I have any burning desire to go. I can tell you when they redevelop and they reopen it, I'd probably go down and check it out. I'd be interested in what the new Ontario Place looks like. But the old Ontario Place, it was a nice memory from when I was a kid, but I could care less if it was there or not.
No, for sure. The last time I was at Ontario Place, Gavin, was at the Chinese Lantern festivals that they used to have there. Probably,
These have great concerts there. I have to say that. I saw B.B. King at Ontario Place at least 6 times. He used to come every summer. It's fantastic.
But anyway, Gavin, in terms of a case like this, look, there are some good takeaways, because it does raise certainly the issue of standing, and this whole idea of public trust. Now, notwithstanding that this case was dismissed, leave to appeal has been granted. So that'll be very interesting to see what grounds leave to appeal was granted on, and what the Court of Appeal deals with in terms of the argument. But for younger listeners, particularly those who are either law students or younger associates, take a read of this decision as well, because it actually has some great commentary on affidavit evidence. And one of the things that the applicant, Ontario Place Protectors, may not have done a very good job of, according to the judgment, is that the affidavits that were placed before the court really didn't speak to the issues and spoke to argument. And affidavits are not the place for argument and opinion. And there was a lot of opinion in the affidavits, which the court basically was very disturbed with, and made some comments about how you properly write an affidavit.
That's very, very instructive and very important to keep the argument out of the evidence. You argue in submissions, you don't argue in evidence, and nothing worse than an argumentative witness being in an affidavit or oral testimony. Anyways, I think that just about brings us to the end of another exciting episode of Beneath the Law. Stephen, thanks so much again for your insight and guidance on all of these great cases that you come up with. This is a really interesting one, and for anyone who's a student of the law, a little deeper dive into that judgment would be obviously instructive. Please tell your friends and rate us if you can on your favorite podcast provider. We love the feedback, and any more subscribers, the broader the discussion group, the better. The law is something that Stephen and I not only do for a living, but it is a living, breathing thing. It is our society, is a reflection of society, and being able to debate it, talk about it, understand it, I think in the long run makes society better, and hopefully this is a very, very small part of that larger dialogue. So please feel free to send us a note if you have comments or concerns, or if you have topics that you'd like to hear our views on. We'd be more than happy to review that. And always remember that if no one is above the law, everyone is beneath it.